Welcome back. I'm Tim Merlander with the Republican Roundtable. It's good to be back with you again. And with me once again is my co-host, Mark Sullivan. Mark, it's good to see you.
Good to see you again, Tim.
And we have a special guest, someone we've had before, and it's good to have you again, Andy Cilek, head of the Minnesota Voters Alliance. Andy, it's very nice to have you.
Yes, welcome.
Thanks so much. It's great to be back in a bigger location. You guys have been moving up.
We're moving on up, that's right. Now, before we get started, let's tell a little bit about you for people who haven't seen you before. Just to talk a little bit about yourself and how you got into the Minnesota Voters Alliance.
Well, we started our group, Matt Marchetti is a co-founder of ours.
Okay.
We started it back in 2004, 2005. And our primary concerns were election issues, election reform issues.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're a 501c4 tax-exempt organization. And we just started taking action, and we've taken a case to the Supreme Court, the Minnesota Supreme Court, back in 2009 on instant runoff voting. That's what I was on with you guys last time.
Okay.
And then now we have a case going to the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, which I believe I was invited on it today to talk a lot about, and that's the case with Richie. But my background, I spent 4 years in the Marine Corps back in the 80s. And then I went to the University of Minnesota and the University of St. Thomas. And I've been working in the venture capital field. I live in Eden Prairie with my girlfriend Sandy, and I spend quite a bit of time in politics.
Okay. Now, Andy, you got a lawsuit going with regard to Section 1 of the Minnesota, Article 7 of the Minnesota Constitution. Is that about right?
Yeah, that pretty much sums it up. I mean, we started looking at a lot of the data, doing a lot of Data Practices Act requests.
Before we get into that, tell everybody what what Section 1 of Article 7 of the Minnesota Constitution is all about and what it says.
Well, Article 7, Section 1 deals with eligibility, and I'm not sure if they're going to show this on the screen.
Eligibility to vote.
Eligibility to vote. Okay, it's real simple. It says every person 18 years of age or more who has been a citizen of the United States for 3 months and who resides in the precinct for 30 days shall be entitled to vote. Okay? Then it says the following person shall not be entitled or permitted to vote at any election in this state. And it goes on to say a person not meeting the above requirements, which are 18 and a citizen, or a person who has been convicted of a felony or treason unless restored to civil rights, a person under guardianship, or a person who is insane or not mentally competent. So this is what our entire lawsuit is based on, is Article 7, Section 1, that we believe clearly places a duty on the state to make a determination of who's eligible, who meets these qualifications, and who doesn't meet any of the disqualifications.
Okay.
And the only way to do that is to check them first.
Okay. Now, how did you get this lawsuit started?
Actually, I was invited on a debate on Channel 9 with a gentleman from the ACLU. And we were talking about some of the different data that's come out. You know, there's 17,000 votes that still haven't been accounted for.
Okay.
Back in the 2008 election with, as you know, Norm Coleman was defeated by Al Franken by 312 votes. Right. So, and I got up the next morning and I thought I wanted to really dig into what that 17,000 number meant that I've been hearing about. That there's 17,000 people who have not been confirmed as being eligible. So we put together very extensive Data Practices Act requests. We spent over $3,500 on Data Practices Act requests to the Secretary of State's office.
Now, I probably should ask before we get going, were these people's votes counted already? In that election, or were they not counted and there's still questions arising as to whether they should have or should not have been counted?
No, they were counted and the election was certified. Mm-hmm. One of the problems we believe with the Minnesota statutes, and that the Minnesota statutes conflict with Article 7, Section 1, is since 1974, Minnesota adopted Election Day registration.
Right. Same
and there's only about
same-day registration.
Same-day registration, Election Day registration. There's only 6 or 7 states that have Election Day registration. Congressman Keith Ellison wants to make it mandatory that states have Election Day registration.
Of course he does. I can't understand why, though.
But in Minnesota, for same-day registration or Election Day registration, according to the county auditor's guide and the statutes, they don't verify those persons' eligibility until after the election.
And
months and years after.
And
I got a
after their
lawyer's
vote has been
question,
counted.
Andy.
Here we go. Now the discussion's getting heated
Now
up
it's
here.
going to get a little interesting.
Okay, good.
How did you get into court? How did you get standing to do this lawsuit?
Well, we have that, and that's a good question. We have, I don't have them all memorized, but we have some people from Duluth, from Harris, Minnesota. We also have Representative Sandra Erickson, Republican in the Minnesota House, is one of our plaintiffs. We also have a guardianship component. We probably don't have a lot of time to get into that, but we have a guardianship claim in our lawsuit, which is very significant because Judge Quam, in a Hennepin County District case, just ruled that if you're under guardianship, because the Constitution says you have to, if you're under guardianship, you can't vote, and then Minnesota passed a law in 2003 said if you're under guardianship, you can vote unless a court said you can't. So clearly there was a conflict there with the statute and the Constitution. So what our claim is if it says under guardianship or not mentally competent, well, we had entire group homes of people that were severely mentally incapacitated being hauled down to the voting booth by their caregivers. It's an exploitation of vulnerable adults to the nth degree, and it's happening all over Minneapolis, all over Minnesota. And so our claim is that if a person has been placed under guardianship and ruled mentally incapacitated, that a court has to make a determination on whether that person knows the nature and effect of voting. They can't be silent on the issue. And sure as heck, Judge Quam in Hennepin County District Court disagreed with Judge Frank in our case. So now in Hennepin County, if you're under guardianship, you have to have a hearing in the probate court on whether or not that you know the nature and effect of your vote. Our goal is to take that statewide because it affects eligibility.
Right.
So whether you're under guardianship or a felon or you don't live there, we believe the state has a duty to make sure a person meets those qualifications before they stick their vote in the ballot box.
Okay. Now, you got into court and you're going up to the Supreme Court. What did the lower district court rule on your particular lawsuit?
No, we're not going to the Supreme Court, though. We're in federal court.
Federal court.
The reason we're in federal court
So
is
you're going to the 8th Circuit.
we're going to the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals. Judge Donovan Frank was our district court judge. We didn't expect to win in that court. Judge Donovan Frank is a Bill Clinton appointee. Okay, Judge Frank has never had a job, I don't believe, outside of a government job. Okay,
That sounds typical.
And to me, and I have a lot of friends in government that are good folks, but when you give a career government employee a robe, to me that's just a little scary. I just don't have a lot of trust in government. But nonetheless, let's look at what this judge said. He said that this lawsuit is based on the erroneous premise that election officials must verify voters' eligibility before their votes are counted. A federal judge said that that our lawsuit is based on the erroneous premise that election officials must verify voters' eligibility before their votes are counted.
Okay.
Now, we believe Article 7 clearly says the state has a duty, and if they're not entitled, or that they shall not be entitled or permitted to vote if they don't meet the qualifications and not meet any of the disqualifications. And in fact, this goes back to 1861, and we have in our record, we studied session laws from 1861 when Article 7, Section 1 was part of the original Constitution. And it stayed the same way it is today. And back then, the election judges had the information on the people, right? And it said that if a person was left off the roster back in 1861, and we have all this submitted for the record, that the election, all the election judges had to personally know that that person met all the qualifications before that person was allowed to vote. Okay, that person had to, so they had to know. Today, all that data is sitting in the SVRS, the statewide voter registration system. So the state has all the information. The state knows who the felons are. They made them felons.
Is this all computerized?
Yes, it's all computerized.
So if an election judge gets somebody who he has reason to question whether they're eligible or not, they can punch this person up and see what the system says?
I don't think the election judges don't have access to that data.
Okay, now how would someone access this data?
Well, I believe the counties do, and then the counties submit it to the Secretary of State. And then they have access, and we're going to be playing a video of exactly what happens. Minnesota has 2 different types of registrations. That's part of our lawsuit. In Minnesota, we have pre-registration, okay, where a person has to register 20 days prior to the election.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
Or, now since 1974, they can come in on election day and register.
Same day.
But prior to that, it was 20 days, that's it. Most states are 30 days, you have to register to vote, and that's it. Now, why do they do that? It makes sense that there's a cutoff. Why? Because the state takes those applications, it's just an application, so they apply for it like they apply for anything else. They apply for the entitlement to vote. The state takes that voter registration applications and they run it through 8 different databases. Department of Public Safety, Department of Corrections, make sure they're not a felon, make sure they're not on the Department of Health, make sure they're not dead.
There's been a few of those.
Got to make sure they're not dead.
There's been a few dead voters I've heard of.
Okay, so there's 8 different databases, and you'll see this on Mark Ritchie's video here. And then they send them a postal verification card. If that card comes back undeliverable, or if something doesn't check out, then that person is challenged when they walk in on election day. And so maybe now is a good time to play that tape, where Mark Ritchie is in a public forum with the Capitol Report, and he says we run them through 8 different databases, and if that person shows up, for example, as a felon, then that person is not allowed to vote.
Okay, let's run the tape now, if you please.
But when somebody sends in a voter registration, so this happens every day, a young person turns 18, there are 8 different databases that are used to double check, and then there's a non-forwardable postcard. So for example, when somebody sends in a voter registration form, let's say it said Mickey Mouse or Tim Tebow. The first thing we would look at is the driver's license number. Does it match a Minnesota driver's license number? And if not, that's not a valid registration. And the person who signed that registration has committed a felony, we will go after them and put them in prison. But if they get past that particular first hurdle, then we'll look, are they potentially a convicted felon? In this case, one of those filmmakers is a felon. That person is not allowed, and they have signed an oath that would have said, I'm not a felon. Of course, they committed another felony. We'll double check to see if the courts have in any way restricted that person's right to vote. We'll look at the question of their citizenship through looking at the records at the Department of Public Safety. We'll see if they are using a name of somebody who potentially has died by the Department of Public Health and the U.S. National Social Security Death Registry. We'll also look through all the other records that we have. So in Minnesota...
So the systems are in place.
Oh, the systems are in place.
Okay, now let's go to what Mr. Ritchie is telling the court as compared to what he tells the people.
Yeah, well, what you just heard is Mark Ritchie told the people of Minnesota that all the systems are in place. We have the highest level of integrity in our elections. If someone's a felon, for example, that person is not allowed to vote. And that's what he says on the video.
Okay.
He says all the systems are in place. There's 2 problems with what Mr. Ritchie just said, the secretary. Number 1 is they don't do the same thing for election day registrants. Okay? They check all these people, that's a really good thing. But now there's 540,000 people that register on election day in 2008, 542,000, and those people, all those systems that the secretary is talking about to check the voters are not implemented till after the election.
And it should be noted that these people's votes are counted before they're even verified. They're counted that day when they vote.
Right. Yeah,
That's almost an invitation to cheat.
Right. And what did
it
he
is.
tell the court?
And now let's take that before we get into what he tells the court. I'd like to just say one thing. Why is this a problem? In the Data Practices Act request that we did, that I alluded to earlier,
Right.
Okay, we want to know all the people who registered on election day in 2008, who are still to this day, 3 years later, listed in the statewide voter registration system as something other than active, meaning they're either inactive or challenged. So when they finally got around to checking these people, there was a problem, okay? And if they would have registered early, and they were checked, like Mark Ritchie says that they're all checked, those people wouldn't have been allowed to vote. There was 48.
But that would have been 20 days to check them if they had registered early, and this is what, 3 or 4 years later?
Well, sometimes it takes
later?
months and even years before they send out all those postal verification cards, apparently. But there's 48,000, and we have this in the court, for the record. There's 48,000 people listed in the statewide voter registration system as we speak right now that registered on election day in 2008.
Okay.
Voted, had their votes counted,
That's 5 years ago now.
and then
4
they were
years ago.
checked, and they still remain in a non-active status, either challenged or inactive, meaning a postcard was sent to them and it came back because no one lived at that address. And so what we're saying to the court is, you know, Your Honor, the defendants here can't tell you whether or not those 48,000 people met the qualifications in Article 7, Section 1 on the day that they voted on Election Day in 2008. So that's really important. But now what is Mark Ritchie telling the court? This is the complete opposite of what we just played. He said all the systems are in place. We don't permit them to vote. If they're a felon, we check them, yada, yada, yada. Here's what he's telling the court. Minnesota law provides state and county election officials with neither the duty nor the authority to investigate individuals' eligibility before their votes are accepted and counted. So he's telling the court that they don't have the state doesn't have the duty or the authority to investigate individuals' eligibility before their votes are counted. But he just got done saying in the video that he checks them and they stop them from voting.
All bases are covered. Don't
All
worry
bases
about
are
it.
covered, but
And then he turns around and basically says, "Yeah, but we can't do it."
Right. I mean, and that's why it's good we have a court system because, I mean.
Well, what the picture I'm getting is that same-day registration is an effective way to circumvent the Minnesota Constitution and make the eligibility rules for voting meaningless, if you can get by with it that easily. That's the picture I'm getting.
Right, but we believe that they could implement election day or same-day registration and verify eligibility at the same time.
Well, this is what I was wondering about before. If you had a setup at each polling place where if somebody comes in to instantaneously register, that you can, in effect, punch out the computer and see what comes up.
Well, I believe that, didn't that come up as one of the options when the voter ID law was being debated before the election? Was, well, hey, you know, instead of the voter ID law, we can just have them come in, show an identification or some proof, you know, and then we can go into a database and check to see if they're valid voters or not, you know, if they qualify.
Right.
And I think that even this was one of the options that was mentioned was you know, well, I have the database available at the various voting precincts.
And they can do that. Now, 44 states have provisional ballots. Okay, and that's how they could have, Minnesota could have same-day or election day registration. And in counties where they couldn't verify to make sure they meet all the qualifications, then they set them aside in a different pile until they check them.
Right, they check them, and then once they're verified, then
Right.
then the vote goes in for the count.
Right, right.
They're not counted until
After
they're verified.
listening to this, I guess my feeling is what they need to do is just abolish same-day registration. It seems to me like it's almost designed for fraud, and if you try to have a system where you're trying to find out whether somebody is eligible or not, you have the election hanging fire while everybody litigates to the end of the litigation trail.
Right. Well, I'd like to share with you, one of our plaintiffs I mentioned earlier was Representative Sandra Erickson, Republican from Princeton.
Yeah.
In 2008, presidential election year, she lost by, I believe, like 81 votes, okay? And there was a high number of election day registrants.
I know how she feels.
In 2010, a non-presidential election year, she won by a landslide. So we went back and we looked at her district for election day registrants. Remember, she lost by 81 votes. Right. She lost by 81 votes. To this day, when we did our Data Practice Act request, of those 48,000 that are still unverified as being eligible, there's something in the ballpark of 250 that are still unverified from Sandra Erickson's district, where she lost by 80 votes. So that's, you mentioned standing earlier.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the reasons why we wanted somebody, a candidate, that had a problem where, you know, there's a significant number of same-day registrants who still haven't been verified, and she only lost by 80 votes.
Okay. Now, we're getting a little bit short of time here. I want to move on because you're taking us up to the 8th Circuit Court, which sits in St. Louis, correct?
I believe that's where it sits.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you going before a three-judge panel, or are you going to be in front of the entire bench? Do you know that?
Three-judge panel.
Three-judge
panel.
Okay.
And now you realize that if you lose in front of the three-judge panel, you can appeal to the full bench of the court.
Yeah, I forget what that's called. You're going to remind me as an attorney. You're going to remind me.
Of course I will.
Well,
That's what
he's
we like to
recovering
do.
attorney.
No, there's a name for that, and it slipped my mind. I just heard it the other day. There's a name when you attempt to go in front of the whole court. We were notified about 2 weeks ago by the court that there will be oral arguments. So that's why a lot of this stuff's going to get flushed out.
Who is your attorney, by the way?
Eric Cardall.
I know Eric.
Mormon and Cardall. You know Eric?
I know Eric.
Okay.
I've had a case with him.
Have you?
Very
that's
interesting experience, but that's another story.
Good. Yeah. So we were notified by the court that there will be oral arguments, so that we know. We're expecting any day now to get assigned a court date and a three-judge panel.
Okay, and you know that who gets assigned to the three-judge panel will make a big difference.
I think it will be. But this is, you know, I'd like to read one thing real quick. I know there's only a minute left. But Judge Quam, you know, you hear the Democrats talking about it's so important to let everybody vote. I mean, you can't not let everybody vote.
Yeah,
well, what he said was courts must also.
They've claimed.
Right. I just want to get this in. Courts must also ensure that no person votes who is not entitled to vote. Anything less dilutes the fundamental rights of the proper electorate, and it likewise deprives the citizenry of a true democracy. And this was from Judge Quam back in just 3 months ago in Hennepin County District Court. So that's what we're here to try to protect, is our right to vote, to not be diluted by ineligible votes.
Okay, now I guess I have one question, but once again, I'm a lawyer, so I'm wondering how come you're in federal court and not in state court?
But, well, we believe that this is a right. We have a First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Ninth, and 11th Amendment claims. Right to association is our First Amendment. Right to vote is a free speech. So if you're a candidate, I have a right to collectively gather and vote for you, right?
Correct.
That's my speech. If that's diluted by ineligible voters, then my association rights are diluted. Right. Likewise, when we go in, when the state doesn't do their job to verify those people, they need to give us the ability to stop those people from voting. That's where we have a Fourth Amendment due process claim.
Okay.
You follow what I'm saying?
Right.
So that's why we're going through the federal courts. And one of the things we have to show is aggravating circumstances, that this isn't just a little deal where some ballots were in a trunk. This is 48,000 people who still haven't been verified. Okay. This is a major deal.
And a continuing problem to boot.
And a continuing problem to boot. Absolutely.
I think we're going to have these kinds of problems as long as we've got same-day registration. Now, if I heard you right before, only 6 states have same-day registration.
I think that's really close.
I believe it's only a few, yes.
Yeah.
It's only a few. But if we had provisional ballots, we could have all the above. I mean, we're not out to try to stop somebody from voting. You know, we want to make sure everybody gets out there to vote, but we want only legitimate voters. Right. People who meet the qualifications spelled out in the Constitution for the last 150 years.
Okay, when do you think this might be heard? What's your time frame?
Spring.
Right? Spring. So so this coming spring, you should be in front of a three-judge panel down in St. Louis.
This will be worth. No, right here.
Right here. Okay.
Right here. Our federal court hearing was actually in St. Paul.
Okay.
So my guess is St. Paul. It possibly could be Minneapolis, but.
Okay, so they have three-judge panels in different states.
Yeah, and there's people from other states watching this. This has impact far beyond Minnesota. I mean, this is fundamental. I mean, to make sure someone's a citizen, to make sure they're, you know, all these qualifications
to ensure they're qualified to vote.
Yeah, so this could turn out, depending on what the court does with it, this could go a long way towards many, many other states.
This sounds like a very interesting lawsuit, Andy. And we're getting pretty close to the end. Do you have any last statements to make before we close out?
No, we have our brief posted on our website, our last brief that was filed in the court. It's a phenomenal read. I mean, it just came out beautifully. And that's on mnvoters.org, mnvoters with an S.org. and it'll be the first thing that comes up. They can download the brief, and we'd love to hear from folks. So they can contact us right through mnvoters.org.
Well, we appreciate the battle you're making, Andy, and I wish you the best of luck. That's all I can say.
Really.
I'd love to see something done on this matter.
Thanks for having me again. It's great to be back here and see you guys. Thank you very much.
Glad to have you here.
And keep fighting. We don't want to lose these battles.
We have to keep up the fight. We have to keep up the fight.
And with that, we're going to have to call it quits. We will see you next month. Thank you and goodbye.